Welcome to Taiwan Talks. I am Annie Kuhl. U.S. Representative Mike Gallagher, who heads the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, recently led a bipartisan group on a 3-day visit to Taiwan. This event has drawn considerable attention from Beijing. Last year, 32 U.S. lawmakers visited Taiwan, raising questions about the reasons behind these frequent visits. What exactly do these objectives have that the Congress members pursue? Additionally, how do their visit affect diplomatic ties between the U.S., China, and Taiwan? Joining us today are Leonard Chao, National Tsinghua University Adjunct Professor, Lev Nachman, National Chengchi University College of Social Sciences Assistant Professor. Now, gentlemen, warm welcome to the show.
Thank you.
As we mentioned earlier, Gallagher is well known for his hawkish stance towards Beijing in response to China's continuous expansion of influence in the Pacific and attempts to undermine Taiwan's diplomatic allies. Gallagher also stated that the U.S. and Taiwan should establish economic coordination mechanisms with partners to resist economic coercion. Now, with Gallagher at the helm of a bipartisan delegation's visit to Taiwan, Beijing has also swiftly voiced its dissatisfaction. The Chinese Foreign Ministry strongly objected to official exchanges between the U.S. and Taiwan. But what exactly is the objective of the Gallagher delegation's visit? I would like to ask Professor first and then Ambassador. What exactly do you think is the main objective behind this visit?
I think, first of all, the most important objective is to show the United States' continued symbolic support of Taiwan, especially in light of the recent national election that was just held here. A lot of these visits have actually been long in the works, even before the election. And the reason there's so many visits from the United States Congress after the election, I think, is in part to show that the United States was ready and willing to support Taiwan regardless of the election outcomes. Whether it was a DPP presidency, a TPP, or a KMT presidency, the United States still wants to have this rock-solid relationship with Taiwan no matter what.
But don't you think at the same time it's going to raise a lot of tension as well? How is the U.S. going to deal with this?
Oh, of course. But it's important to keep in mind that it really doesn't matter when, how, who, or why the United States interacts with Taiwan. Everything the United States does will irk Beijing.
Okay.
I think it's a matter of taking calculated stances and calculated moments in order to show the Taiwanese side that the United States is willing to stand with Taiwan regardless.
And Ambassador?
Well, okay, in the light of the lack of diplomatic ties between Taiwan and the United States, without any official relation between our two countries, and so the kind of a so-called substantive relation between two peoples of the two countries have thus become very important. So particularly in this context, that the friendship or some gesture and the real action from the U.S. Congress friends are particularly really appreciated, and also they are we are in need of this kind of support from the American people, and of which the congressmen are the representatives of the real people. So this kind of visit of Congressman Gallagher is not it's not the first one, and we have witnessed must be hundreds of U.S. congressional people from both the House and the Senate. They've been visiting Taiwan over the past decades. And there was a time back in the 1990s when I was in Washington, dealing with the Capitol Hill as a TACO's director for the congressional office. So I had the pleasure of working and dealing with the friends on the Capitol Hill in both houses. I feel very, very grateful, and it's a fond memory of my humble self for working with them during those days. And now seeing that Mr. Gallagher, leading such a bipartisan delegation visiting Taiwan again, I was very, very, kind of remissive, very, very, it brought me back to those days, But in this context, speaking of the Chinese reaction, I don't think we need to take their words so seriously, because, it's becoming like it's a stereotype. The script. Whenever there are U.S. public office holder or any high-ranking officials or any celebrities visiting Taiwan, and then follow up with some good words and real great friendship support, that the Beijing always came up later on. In no time, there's some criticism, kind of a soundbite and quarreling, and we have to learn to take them. very, just let them speak what they're supposed to speak, or what they're paid to speak about those, anti-U.S. and friendship with Taiwan. So I think we just, to leave it like that.
Okay, so we're very positive about this, and as this is also a gesture to show a friendship gesture and also a U.S. Perspective towards Taiwan, regardless of the election and who is going to be the president. But as we can see, since former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan 2 years ago, there has been an uptick, in the number of U.S. lawmakers traveling to Taiwan, as we mentioned earlier, with 32 making a journey in 2023. Now, despite this, based on what we were seeing for the past year, what exactly do you think is this kind of a trend for the U.S.-Taiwan relations now, Professor?
Yeah, I think, Nancy Pelosi certainly opened the gates of what a lot of American politicians thought was necessary to show their support for Taiwan. And even though a lot of these symbolic visits do have their value, there was a time when I think a lot of people had to ask themselves, does plus one more visit from the United States add that much more for Taiwan? Now, of course, I don't think it inherently hurts, and I think these, visits are, good, strong, and meaningful, and ought to happen. But it most certainly became somewhat of a trend for a lot of American politicians who a lot of the time seem to come to Taiwan without really much knowledge about Taiwan or really understanding what it is. There are certainly a few politicians who had some scandalous photo moments at some certain parts of Taiwan who, taking pictures at the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial and reminiscing about Taiwanese democracy without realizing that he was the former authoritarian dictator, these kinds of things.
Do you think at the same time, when these governmental officials or community members coming into Taiwan, they also have their own agenda for their own self-interest?
Oh, of course, especially because we have an American election coming up, it's very meaningful for, U.S. politicians to show that they're tough on China. Now, the concern is that there's a difference between sticking it to China and standing up for Taiwan. We often think those must be the same thing, and that's not true. Especially as an American voter, I very much care that my American politicians are not just standing up for Taiwan as a way to, irk China for the sake of their voting base back home, but out of genuine concern for Taiwan's well-being.
Exactly. And Ambassador, do you think this is also maybe a public relations strategy for a lot of the politicians in the U.S., especially that election is coming up?
Well, yes, I think just a moment, I say that we have to, express our appreciation, our, the gratitude to those U.S. congressional friends for their good, action and friendships support. However, to be as a former foreign service officer representing Taiwan and the U.S. and Washington D.C., I have to frankly say that we have to exercise certain amount of objective perspectives about this kind of a U.S. friendship from the Capitol Hill people. Although being grateful, also I agree with what Lev just mentioned, that this it's an election year for the United States.
Right.
So we have to be on guard for those any words from the U.S. politicians, particularly with their polarized partisan, extremely getting partisan. As you know, Donald Trump is coming up, is looming. And that might be a very, threatening competitor to the incumbent President Biden. So, the U.S. Politicians, the congressmen, they're trying to use this kind of a gesture, pro-Taiwan, anti-China, as a good gesture to garner some of the votes, for their election. So I would like to say that I would like to comment on the Chinese reaction. Sometimes I don't think that China should take too serious out of this one, because the more you are criticizing those U.S. congressmen, the visit and words of friendship, and then the more you are jumping into the traps by the U.S. politicians. Good. Okay. Thank you for your criticism. Obviously, the more you criticize me, and the more votes I'm going to garner.
Right.
As a very reasonable Taiwanese intellectual or former foreign officer, I'd like to sincerely suggest that China, you have to learn somehow. You have to learn somewhere. How come you keep repeating this kind of very naive, very simple-minded? It doesn't behave like a big country's behavior. So still back to what we're supposed to do for as a Taiwanese people, that we have to keep ourselves more cool-headed. Don't get too overly excited by this kind of friendship, because obviously when China is criticizing and then we are happy And then we somehow, unfortunately, somewhere down the road, we expressed our overly excitement, to the U.S. congressman, and then counter, it's kind of a, anti-Chinese, anti-Beijing sentiment coming up among our people.
Okay, so, Professor, I think Ambassador also made a very important point that this could also be a very repetitive loop for the past 2 years.
Yeah.
We're not really seeing a very concrete result, specifically that's beneficial to Taiwan. So you staying in Taiwan for so many years, from your observation and seeing, what's going on recently, the whole situation, what is your take on this?
I would maybe very gently push back on the framing. I do think there have been concrete deliverables from the United States over the last few years that have been meaningful. There's been multiple policy acts that have passed in the United States that have helped supply arms for Taiwan, that have allowed for these very, medium length or at least medium level participations between the two sides of each government.
Yeah.
And those matter. The question is whether or not these more symbolic gestures by the United States matter versus substantive policy offerings from the United States. We have this debate all the time about substance versus symbolism and which one Taiwan should prioritize more and which one the United States should be more sort of cautious of. But even though ever since Nancy Pelosi, of course, that really sort of marks a change in the relationship, even though there has been a lot of symbolic support, which is not as meaningful as substantive support, there has still been important substantive support from the United States as well. And there's a lot of people in DC and in Taiwan that are doing their best to very gently nudge policymakers in the direction of thinking about substance instead of symbolism so much.
So we're kind of saying that, we're not really looking into an immediate result, but this simple symbolic gestures, it's also a way for them to continuously raise awareness of what's going on geopolitically. Is that correct?
Yeah, and this isn't to say that symbolism doesn't mean anything. It's very important, and especially I think here in Taiwan, Taiwanese voters feel very seen with these kinds of symbolic victories. So I don't want to say they don't matter, but I think relative to policy deliverables, there's that cost benefit between the two.
But putting Taiwan aside, based on what we're seeing recently, all these gestures and all these actions and all these reactions from China, do you also think that these frequent visits from the U.S. to Taiwan could also jeopardize an improving relationship perhaps for both the U.S. and China?
I'd like to point out the first one is that the fundamental structure, the trilateral fundamental structure between the relation between the U.S., Taiwan, and China, that they will remain unchanged.
Yeah.
Remain unchanged. In other words, that the diplomatic ties between Beijing and Washington will stay where they are, and also the unofficial informal relation between Taipei and Washington will keep unchanged. So any visit, if I may be allowed to frankly say that any single visit by any members of the U.S. Congress would not whatsoever change this kind of fundamental structure of the relation between the three sides. So, and don't get overly, as I repeatedly like to suggest, that don't get overly excited by this kind. But symbolism is important. Symbolism, we mentioned that about that, but also we need that some symbolic behavior by the U.S. friends, Congress, but also we need some reality. We need some very concrete action. If I may add up one thing, that many years ago when we started our work with the U.S. Congress, just shortly after our diplomatic the breakup, and then we start working with the capital because the State Department or the White House. They're turning Taiwan aside, and obviously we had to rely on the friendship support on the Capitol Hill. At that moment, our office in Washington D.C. we have strongly staffed some of the so-called congressional liaison office. At that moment, the Chinese embassy in Washington is a new embassy in Washington. They don't care about what the congressional work is.
Okay.
They ignore the congressional work. As long as we have diplomatic ties to be established with the U.S. administration, we don't need and we don't want to care whatever they're doing. And suddenly, so many years later, they are focusing unproportionately focusing on the role of the U.S. Congress. I think it doesn't make sense. So I think they're overly exaggerating the importance of. But I'd like to say that that in the foreign policy making and execution of the United States, the major responsibilities lie in the hands of the U.S. executive branch, namely the White House, NSC, and the State Department. Okay, so very hardly that have any role being played by the U.S. Congress, unless and until several major special case such as the Taiwan Relations Act, the enactment of Taiwan TRA, and also the other one is late President Lee Teng-hui's visit to Cornell. That is where and how the U.S. Capitol Hill, the Congress reversed the course, changed the policy. But that's a very unusual precedence. But other than that, very rarely we have seen that the Congress can steal the show of the U.S. administration.
And Professor, do you agree with this?
The ultimate goal, I think, is for the United States and the PRC to be able to find a floor to stand on and develop a meaningful relationship regardless of the U.S.'s relationship with Taiwan. Now, of course, that's impossible because Taiwan is the reason there's so much contention between the United States and China. So what I think it's a matter of doing is at the very least trying to establish a bottom line and channels of communication between Beijing and Washington, D.C., so that at the very least we can avoid miscommunications and misunderstandings. And there's clearly been a lot of efforts at this, at least in the United States. We know that there's attempts to have a Biden and Xi meeting in the near future, which is good. I think there's a lot of people who forget that a good, meaningful relationship between the United States and China is good for Taiwan. It helps at the very least minimize the risk of miscalculation, misunderstanding, and mistake. And ultimately, that's what helps maintain peace in the Taiwan Strait.
And one more question is that apart from semiconductors that we're seeing, what do you think exactly is the additional value that Taiwan can provide to the U.S. that could at the same time also attract a lot of these bipartisan coming into Taiwan and to support Taiwan, Professor?
Yeah, beyond semiconductors, that's just one very small thing of why Taiwan matters. Taiwan is, for themselves spent decades trying to build up a meaningful democratic country. And the values that Taiwan espouses through its democracy are far more in line with the United States and democracies around the world than any sort of, non-democracy. The need to help defend Taiwan, maintain its sovereignty is not, just for semiconductors, but because it's a matter of trying to help make sure that there's no sort of outside imposed regime change onto a democracy that the people here chose to make democratic.
And Ambassador?
Yes, I agree that democracy is our best with the best asset to most of the American friends. As a matter of fact, there was a time in the last century that the people of Taiwan particularly tend to categorize that the two parties of the U.S. One is relatively pro-China, and one is relatively sympathized to Taiwan. But as a matter of fact, it's long gone. Now the friendship of the American people toward Taiwan is kind of getting increasingly cross-party boundary. It's a bipartisan consensus. Yeah. I've witnessed that many years ago. So I found that very, very grateful and very comfortable. And because why cause that? Very simple, that because the people in Taiwan, they were decent, and given the long-standing relationship between the Americans and Taiwanese over the past more than a half a century, that has laid the ground for the strong ties, strong bond between the two peoples. Okay, so now the China has been unnecessarily and unreasonably and unwisely so sentimental, so ideologically against Taiwan, and that is simply putting them into a very, very unbeneficial situation. So so China is repeating their mistake. China, has a long way to go for understanding and getting really understand what the Americans are up to. So they have. When I was watching them many years ago, I came up with a rather a joke. I said, PRC stands for what PRC stands for. We know what PRC stands for. But my saying to American friend, I said, is a public relations calamity. They're not very good at running it. But still, that's their problem. So now we have to understand. But seriously, the Taiwanese, we also need to be more understanding of the both Washington and Beijing. Right. So we have to approach both of the big powers in the way of serving the best interest of our people, of our country. So don't jump to any traps of both of them.
And looking at the bigger picture here, amid Gallagher's visit to Taiwan, the U.S. Defense Secretary Cooperation Agency declared its intention to sell arms to Taiwan with a deal valued at $75 million US dollars. Now, this transaction represents the first U.S. arms sale to Taiwan after its presidential election in January, occurring amidst escalating tensions in the Taiwan Strait. Now, additionally, this is the 13th arms sale to Taiwan under President Biden's administration. Now, in the U.S. Congress, there appears to be no calls for reducing military support to Taiwan. So do you think that this can also suggest that the U.S. perceives the situation in Taiwan as very different from that we're seeing in Ukraine right now, Professor?
Yeah, one of the concerns we see in the United States is that there seems to be a very sharp change in tone when talking about Ukraine and the United States' support for Ukraine in a way that, we have not seen that happen to Taiwan, at least yet. There's a lot of concern, as was said earlier, about partisanship in the United States and what could happen to Taiwan as an issue if it becomes partisan. Now, thankfully, for decades now, and as we've just seen from this most recent visit, there's no sign that partisanship is going to really kick in and that we see both Democrats and Republicans supporting Taiwan evenly. But what we see happening with Ukraine right now is what was once a bipartisan issue is now becoming partisan. And this has just happened in the span of a year. So, even though Taiwan is okay for now, I think it is still meaningful that we at least make sure we are checking with both parties that Taiwan is going to be able to stay at this bipartisan level and that Taiwan is not going to see a break in support in the way that we're currently seeing for Ukraine.
Well, I'm personally and professionally not very high on the comparing Taiwan to Ukraine.
Right.
In other respects, and because of two countries and two situations and two geopolitical region. So this is not a good issue for making comparison between arms sale to Taiwan and arms sale to Ukraine. The first of all, and secondly, that I have to if I may try to share my thought with the audience that the arms sales, any arms sale of the United States to any other foreign country, it's not a simple matter of buying and selling and this kind. It's a small part of a foreign overall undertaking of a foreign policy execution or foreign policy making. And so and the U.S. definitely they will come up with some very comprehensive thought and policy design for the priority and relocation of the resources. Also, it involves not only the U.S. the executive branch, the administration, NSC, but also the Pentagon and also the Capitol Hill and several selective committees of both houses, armed sales and military affairs committee. They have to get involved. So this armed sales is a very complicated issue. Of course, we have to keep in mind the U.S. has a budget and also has a limited resource. And when I was in Washington in my first tour back in the 1980s, I was kind of the front runner for the pushing, lobbying for the U.S. arms sale to Taiwan shortly after our diplomatic breakup. Right,
but here's the final question I would like to ask, gentlemen, because given, as we mentioned earlier, given Trump's opposition to provide aid to Kyiv, if he were to be re-elected, as the president of the United States, will this also signal a significant shift in the U.S. approach to Taiwan? Because I think this is what the Taiwanese people are actually being really worried about too. Well, are we going to face a similar situation to that, like Ukraine, in the future? And if that is the case, how should Taiwan prepare for themselves? We'll go with Professor first.
Yeah, I think ultimately if Trump is reelected, we're in for a world of uncertainty that is really difficult to predict. The biggest reason it's difficult to predict is because everything we knew about Trump's policy towards Taiwan was done by people like Mike Pompeo and his team. And they've all sort of turned against Trump. Even someone like Matt Pottinger, who was very fond of supporting Taiwan meaningfully, testified against Donald Trump, which means there's no way that he's ever going to be working with Donald Trump again. So if Trump is reelected, what we don't know is who the heck is going to be managing China and Taiwan in his foreign policy team. And given Trump's rhetoric towards Taiwan and China over the last couple of years, this leads to a lot of just, I think, scary uncertainty for people both in the United States and Taiwan.
So just to follow up on what you just said earlier, there's a lot of uncertainty and we cannot jump into a conclusion at this point of time because there's too much to predict. But before the election, in the meantime, due to this very short time frame, how can Taiwan prepare itself and its relation with the U.S.? Is there anything that Taiwan can do at this point of time?
I think it's a matter of continuing to double down on how Taiwan is just as bipartisan on the United States as the United States is with Taiwan, and that Taiwan wants to work with either a Democratic or a Republican administration, and that Taiwan is not going to pick sides and wants to be able to maintain its level of relationship with the United States regardless of who wins this November.
Okay, and Ambassador?
Well, I think this question, could U.S. parts toward Taiwan change? I think it's a rhetoric question. It's a rhetoric question. We all know the answer. So it's therefore a kind of a no-brainer, as a matter of fact. So U.S. policy toward Taiwan over the past few decades, they keep changing. They keep changing, of course, because they are adopting, they're designing the policy toward Taiwan based on the interests or based on the interpretation, the American interpretation of their national interests. What is serving the U.S. interests better, and they go for that. Whether it's kind of they don't care about what is going to happen in Taiwan. If I may be bluntly say that I'm not a diplomat, so I'm saying what I have in mind. But we have to be careful, of course. I think it goes for all the countries concerned, even Taiwan, not only the U.S., China, U.S., UK, and Japan. So we have to keep our national interests in mind. We have to keep the safety, the well-being of our people in mind, dealing with China and also dealing with the United States.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, gentlemen. If you like our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching our show today. Stay safe and see you all next time.